Hello, friends. Hope you're doing well today. Today, I'm going to read another chapter from Japanese Studies in Britain, a survey and history. So that's why I've got the background I have. This is the book itself, which arrived just a couple of days ago from England, from the Japan Society in London. And I've been reading from it, as you may know, if you've looked at the other videos that I've been doing. Um, I got this one uh, free as a Japan Society member, uh, but I had to pay for the postage. So, but it wasn't very expensive. So anyway, I'm glad to have this now. Although I actually read from the PDF, and that's what I'm about to share with you. So here we go. Share. Yes, there we are. So today I'm going to read Chapter 21, the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation and Japanese Studies in UK Universities by Jason James. And the reason I'm going to read this one next, it's not in order, as you will know, I think, or may know. I've done the first 5 chapters, I think, but now I'm jumping up to 21. And the reason is I've got the author's permission recently by email to read this. So, who is the author? Well, if we skip to the explanation of authors, Jason James has been Director General of the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation since 2011. A graduate of the Japanese department at Cambridge, he was previously Head of Research at HSBC's Tokyo office and Director of the British Council in Japan. Okay. So if we move to the, whoops, that's strange. Finish searching. I thought I had one more. Yes, there we are. This is what I'm going to read. So we can start more or less immediately. Go scroll down a little bit. There we are. Okay. I'm just going to get rid of this stuff. Uh, and maybe get rid of this as well. That's better. And now we're just going to focus on the text itself. Good. So the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation and Japanese Studies in UK Universities. Chapter 21 of Japanese Studies in Britain, a Survey and History. Jason James. The Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation was established in 1988, generously funded by donations from Daiwa Securities totaling £20 million over its first 2 years. From the beginning, education was its core mission. The first of the Foundation's 3 charitable objects set out in the trust deed is the advancement of the education of the citizens of the United Kingdom and the citizens of Japan in each other's institutions, business organizations, economy, culture, heritage, history, language, literature, art, music, and medical and scientific achievements. The other 2 objects also refer to education and describe the Foundation's objectives of giving scholarships and grants respectively. Although the trust deed itself implies a symmetrical education of both countries about each other, there was always a perception that it was more at the UK end that education was required. With English as the lingua franca of international exchange, there was no shortage of Japanese people with knowledge of the UK's language, but very few British people had knowledge of Japanese. Well, it's a very difficult language, of course. One undated early document in the Foundation's archives states that underlying the establishment of the Foundation lay the belief that the emergence of Japan as a world power had left large gaps in the United Kingdom's and Europe's understanding of modern Japan. Resources were still needed if the United Kingdom were to begin to have the same understanding of Japan that Japan already had of the West. Similarly, a note dated February 1992 states that The history of Anglo-Japanese links until now indicates that Japan has been learning and importing from Britain educational skills, culture, and the rules of society, and this movement has been slightly one-sided. However, from now on, we would like Britain to learn more about Japan. I strongly endorse that. I do translations from Japanese to English for that very reason. Within a couple of months of the Foundation's establishment, Sir Hugh Cortazzi, then chairman of the Japan Society, wrote to Chino Yoshitoki, then chairman of Daiwa Securities and vice chairman of the Foundation, on the 4th of October 1988, stating that he was very interested in the development of Japanese studies in the UK, and attaching an article he had recently written on the subject for the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, in which he emphasized that while we need no longer be ashamed of our efforts in Japanese studies, resources are not yet adequate to build up a significant core of Japanologists. Japanese studies departments at UK universities were quick to follow Cortazzi's lead in approaching the Foundation. Some of them, most notably Cambridge, where Japanese studies owed its very survival through the late 1980s to his intervention, had been struggling with funding, and when they heard of the substantial resources controlled by the Daiwa Foundation, they rapidly started making proposals to it for using the money. Support for university Japanese studies departments immediately became the main topic discussed at early trustees meetings as a possible use for the Foundation's resources. At the second meeting in January 1989, it was proposed that approximately half of the Foundation's total spending should go on a main theme to be selected. It was suggested that the teaching of the Japanese language might be an appropriate initial theme. By the third meeting in September that year, it was agreed that, as a general guideline, a sum of £2.5 million should be allocated for grants to Japanese studies and related activities at British universities and other institutions, and selected projects of a more general nature. Of this, the lion's share, £2 million, was to go to universities to support Japanese studies. A number of grants were made by the trustees on an ad hoc basis in the early days of the Foundation's existence, and several of these supported Japanese studies in universities. In 1989, the following grants were made. The University of Cambridge was given £20,000 towards computer cataloguing of the Japanese language holdings in its library. Liverpool John Moores University Business School was given £72,000 towards the cost of introducing Japanese as part of its BA Hons International Business Studies degree, and £47,000 was given through the Japan Foundation Endowment Committee to fund 2 PhD students in Japanese studies. The development of a formal strategy, however, did not begin until the appointment of Christopher Everett in January 1990 as the Foundation's first Director General. The rather haphazard and unfocused nature of their early grant giving was a concern for the trustees, and in their January 1990 meeting, they considered that from now on this focus would be supplied by the £2 million to be allocated to universities, and beyond that by the programme of Daiwa Scholarships if the Director General's studies showed this to be feasible. In the end, it was the Daiwa Scholarships programme, launched in 1991, that became the Foundation's flagship activity. Nevertheless, the first really substantial spending undertaken by the Foundation was a set of grants made in 1990, focused on funding Japanese studies posts at UK universities. Christopher Everett embarked on a series of visits to universities early in the year, and the resulting grants were awarded in May. In the end, the grants made under this programme were as follows: £140,000 to Downing College, Cambridge for three-year research fellowships to Japanese studies, £130,000 to Cardiff University for a lectureship in Japanese language, £140,000 to SOAS for a lectureship in Japanese economics, £140,000 to Manchester University for a lectureship and a lectorship in Japanese language, £125,000 to Newcastle University for a lectureship in Japanese language, £140,000 to Oxford University for a lectureship in Japanese linguistics attached to a fellowship at Hertford College, £130,000 to Stirling University for a lectureship in Japanese,
£100,000 to Sheffield University for a lectureship in Japanese linguistics, £122,000, £122,980 to Sheffield University Huddersfield Polytechnic for a joint lectureship in Japanese language and studies, £115,000 following an initial £35,000 granted in 1989 to Imperial College London for a lectureship in the Japan-Europe Industry Research Centre, £80,000 to Essex University for research projects. These were two collaborative projects with Japanese institutions and were not in the field of Japanese studies. £72,000 to the Needham Research Institute, Cambridge, for two-year visiting fellowships for Japanese historians of science. £50,000 to the Royal Society for Japanese Language Instruction for postdoctoral researchers going to Japan. £100,000 to the Japan Library Group to enable post-1968 holdings of Japanese books in all British university libraries to be recorded on a single computer database accessible to all. This project was led by Dr. Peter Kornitsky of Cambridge University. The above list of grants falls a little short of the planned £2 million, but there were some additional grants made later in the same fiscal year. For instance, £10,000 was given to the University of York in November to help establish a lectureship in Japanese music, while £130,000 was given to the University of Stirling in January 1991 to fund a post in Japanese linguistics. In the end, the total size of the program probably reached the target level. It can be seen from the list above that the focus at this initial stage was very much on posts in Japanese language or linguistics. The various posts were not permanently endowed, but were funded for as long as each grant would cover, generally 5 to 7 years. When the foundation made its awards, it expressed the hope that universities would make the lectureships permanent, but this was not a formal condition. Some posts duly became permanent, in inverted commas, though permanence is an elusive concept in the university sector. Yes, indeed. And some permanent posts were terminated when the relevant department was later closed. Other posts simply expired when the funding from the foundation ran out. The lectureship at Imperial College was terminated even earlier, when the Japan-Europe Industry Research Centre was closed in 1993, with the unused balance of £22,000 being returned to the foundation. There was some unhappiness among the universities themselves about the non-permanent nature of the foundation's funding. The 1993 report on Japanese language teaching at British universities and centres of higher education, produced by the UK-Japan 2000 group, noted that whilst all institutions were enormously grateful for any outside help, many pointed out that the uncertainty and short-term nature of this funding makes planning for the long term extremely difficult. There were several reasons why the foundation was not prepared to endow posts on a permanent basis. One was that the trustees did not entirely trust that the universities, if given permanent control over the funding, would not divert it to other areas at some point in the future. It's a reasonable fear, I think. Even within the time frame of the 1990 grants, Hertford College, Oxford attempted to divert their funding to a fellowship in mathematics when the initial holder of their Japanese linguistics fellowship moved on, though Everett got wind of this and nipped it in the bud. Perhaps a more important reason was that the foundation was not absolutely confident that the expansion in Japanese studies was permanent, and we weren't entirely confident that every university would succeed. Everett. There was a deliberate decision to spread the funding beyond the established centres of SOAS and Oxbridge, but the trustees were aware that not all the seeds they were sowing would take firm root. Where they did, the feeling was that the university should, in the longer term, be happy to fund posts out of their own resources. A final factor, perhaps, was that while Japanese departments would have welcomed permanent endowed funding, the broader universities of which they were a part may have been less enthusiastic. Permanent posts can prove troublesome in the very long term if they outlive their usefulness. This funding of University Japanese Studies posts was the Foundation's first major program, but there was a feeling among the trustees that they should be taking a more proactive role than simply doling out money in response to university requests, and should develop their own independent programs. The Daiwa Scholarships scheme was the first tangible result of this policy and remains the Foundation's flagship program to this day. This program sends young British graduates to Japan and trains them in Japanese, but it specifically excludes candidates who already have a degree in Japanese studies, though some of them, such as Professor Hugo Dobson of the University of Sheffield, ended up moving into the field at a later stage. The Daiwa Scholarship Program appears to have been Christopher Everett's idea, and as it came to fruition with the first scholars elected in 1991, it gained enthusiastic backing from the trustees, not least from Mr. Chino. He remained an enthusiastic supporter of the scholarship program over the years, commenting in 1998, according to a handwritten note by Everett, "Daiwa Scholar is the core grant of the foundation. It must be maintained. Most adamant." This program was one factor diverting the foundation's attention away from university Japanese studies departments, though of course the funding for university posts provided in 1990 continued for a number of years thereafter. In 1993, Everett produced a paper for the trustees reviewing the effect of the university grants made in 1990-1991. The overall conclusion was that they had made a significant impact on Japanese studies at university level. Although the grant to Imperial College London had not worked out, the trustees were pleased to see that as many as 5 of the 10 fellowships and lectureships might become permanent posts. Where posts proved unsustainable beyond the initial funding round, the foundation was inclined to accept that result rather than take on the burden of funding them indefinitely. Everett noted in his paper, "I suspect that some universities may apply to us in due course for renewal of grants, but all are aware that we are unlikely to be able to give a positive answer." In fact, Christopher Everett's successor as Director General, Professor Marie Comte-Helm, commented to me that she believed only a very few of the posts funded by the foundation survived in the longer term, singling out the one at Birkbeck, established in 1994. Consistent with its view that if posts were to prove sustainable, universities should ultimately prove willing to provide the necessary funding themselves, the foundation only part-funded the next round of posts it provided. In 1994, grants of £75,000 each were made to Birkbeck College, University of London, and Pembroke College, Cambridge, neither of which had received funding in the 1990-1991 round. These grants were for 5-year posts and were conditional on the colleges providing matching funding. Interestingly, these 2 posts were both in Japanese history, by contrast with the focus on Japanese language and linguistics in the 1990-1991 round. Similarly, in 1995, £30,000 was given to the University of Hull as a contribution towards, rather than full funding of, the cost of a Japanese language teaching post. In the mid-1990s, the foundation was engaged in various projects to assess the value of its grant giving, and its focus on Japanese studies in the university sector was also continued by its production of 2 reports. One, produced in 1996 for the Japanese Embassy, reported on the specific issue of Japanese study tours, while the other, with support from the Japan Foundation, was a broader survey of the Japanese studies sector entitled Japanese Degree Courses 1996-7. The field of Japanese studies was showing encouraging growth at the time, suggesting relatively little need for the foundation to fund more posts. The main funding problem identified in the report was the expense of sending Japanese studies undergraduates on study tours to Japan as part of their course. Some funding for study tours had been provided by local councils as part of the overall tuition payments made by them to universities, but this funding tended to be inadequate given the very high costs of travel to and subsistence in Japan. The Japan Foundation Endowment Committee, JFEC, provided support in this area for a while, but withdrew in 1993 to focus instead on research funding. In its early days, the foundation periodically chipped in from its general grant programs to help universities or individual students with the cost of study tours. There was a £3,000 grant in 1990, for instance, towards the cost of students from Durham University attending an intensive Japanese language course in Kyoto, while £25,000 was given to the Japan Foundation Endowment Committee in the same year to support its work in this area. Grants to support study tours were also made to a number of individual students, but the foundation never initiated a dedicated program to support study tours to Japan and was unwilling to replace the JFEC funding when this was withdrawn. The amounts of money required were just too large given the foundation's other commitments. Another factor was that some of the trustees felt strongly that we shouldn't be doing the work of government and providing replacement funding for sources of official funding that had dried up. Marie Comte-Helm. As government funding, not only for study tours but also for student living expenses and tuition fees, gradually dried up over the years, the Foundation remained reluctant to fill the gap. It remains the Foundation's policy that school, college, or university fees and research or study by an individual school or college or university student are specifically excluded from the Foundation's general grant programs. The environment changed significantly after the turn of the millennium, with Japanese studies starting to shrink after its growth in the previous decade. The changes are brought out in the publication Japanese Degree Courses 2001 to 2002, an updated version of the 1997 edition jointly produced by the Foundation together with the Japan Foundation. Stirling closed its Japanese department in 2001, and Durham announced in 2003 that it would follow suit. The Foundation complained about these decisions, but having seen its role as the provision of seed corn for departments that subsequently might or might not prove sustainable, did not feel it was in a position to buck the market, as Mrs. Thatcher might have put it. As the sector continued to face funding difficulties, it was eventually the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, with funding from the Nippon Foundation, that stepped up to provide a major program of funding for Japanese studies lectureships announced in 2007. This, in turn, led the Daiwa Foundation to shift its focus away from universities towards developing a program to support Japanese language teaching in schools, though in the end, budget pressures meant that nothing much came of this. In recent years, the Foundation has continued to provide substantial resources to universities through its regular grants programs, but Japanese studies departments have had to compete with a wide variety of UK-Japan collaborations or other projects going on elsewhere within universities. An analysis of Daiwa awards and small grants made since 2010 suggests that, in total, around half of all grants made by the Foundation go to universities in the UK or Japan. If larger scientific grants made through the Royal Society Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation International Exchanges Scheme, which ran until 2014, are included, grants made to universities have probably accounted for around two-thirds of all grant giving by the Foundation in recent years. Grant giving to universities includes grants to support projects in Japanese studies departments, or sometimes East Asian studies departments. But my analysis suggests that these have accounted for only around 4% of overall grant giving, excluding grants made via the Royal Society programme, around £50,000 over the period out of total grant giving of £1.2 million. While this percentage may seem low, it nevertheless implies that, as one would expect, Japanese studies departments are punching well above their weight in terms of the grants they receive from the Foundation, given that these departments account for only a tiny part of the overall universities to which they belong. As for funding for Japanese studies students, the earlier concerns about the cost of study tours seem like a distant dream. It seemed reasonable to worry about this in the days when students had both their tuition fees and a means-tested maintenance allowance paid by the government. In the current environment, in which students take out large loans to cover their tuition fees and living expenses, the cost of study in Japan is the least of their problems, and indeed, given lower Japanese tuition fees and a weak yen, it may well work out cheaper than the cost of study back at home. It seems clear that as state funding for university students in general was steadily withdrawn, any contribution the Foundation might have made to help Japanese studies students would have had to be very tightly targeted so as not to risk overwhelming its other activities. Nevertheless, the Foundation has become increasingly concerned about the difficulties faced by students, particularly since the trebling of domestic undergraduate tuition fees to a maximum of £9,000 in 2012. While this does not seem to have discouraged many young people from undertaking a first degree, there must be a real worry that, having already built up debts probably in excess of £50,000 during their BA, Japanese studies students will be reluctant to continue into postgraduate work. So in 2015, following a similar initiative from the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation and supported by generous additional funding from Daiwa Securities, the Daiwa Foundation announced a new scholarship program aimed specifically at helping postgraduates in Japanese studies, the Daiwa Scholarships in Japanese Studies. From the very early days of the Foundation, the Daiwa Scholarship Program was occasionally criticized for the fact that graduates in Japanese studies were specifically excluded from it. Since the core part of the Daiwa Scholarships is an intensive course in Japanese, it was reasonable enough to exclude those who had already done a full university course, But this stricture did have the effect that the young people who had made the deepest commitment to Japan were the only ones unable to benefit from the Foundation's scholarships. This too is not entirely unreasonable. The Foundation's objective is to spread interest in and knowledge of Japan in the UK, so giving scholarships to established Japanese specialists would have felt a bit like preaching to the converted. The new scheme, for an initial trial period of 5 years, will fund at any one time up to 6 British postgraduate students in Japanese studies attached to either UK or Japanese universities. The first 2 recipients were selected in 2015. The Foundation hopes through this scholarship scheme to ensure that the next generation of British experts in Japanese studies can be nurtured and themselves nurture future generations of British students. And that is indeed the end. The next chapter is about the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, Japanese Studies Funding and Policy, 1985 to 2016. All right, so I will stop the share now. Thank you for persevering and listening up to this point, if you have done. You clearly have done if you're listening to me now, unless you've skipped a bit. Yeah, Daiwa has clearly played the Daiwa Foundation has clearly played a major part in the promotion of Japanese studies in Britain, and long may it continue. And with that, I think I will conclude this video. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Goodbye. Sayonara.